Thank you very much. Okay. Good morning, everybody. It's lovely to be here at the University of Nottingham, and it's a lovely venue for this Open Learning Conference. I have to admit that the climate change from Nairobi to here was somewhat traumatic, but thankfully the sun came out this morning, and that's just about made up for that. I'd like to thank the Open Learning Conference organizers and the University of Nottingham for inviting us here today, for the privilege of asking me to give this keynote address to such an experienced gathering of educationalists here at Nottingham. This morning, as Wynne just said, I'd like to speak with you about open educational resources in the developing countries in which we, as Open Educational Resources Africa, work. And while the concept of OER may indeed mean different things to different people, it is clearly underpinned by the notion of collaboration, of partnering or inclusivity, a concept, therefore, of providing an open welcome to others and opening oneself to others. So given that, I felt it would be important to also speak a little about how our understanding of these sorts of terms tempers our working relationships, and indeed our expectations of what an effective OER collaboration should be. And finally, although I lived and studied in the UK for a number of years, and it is good to be back, I never had the opportunity to visit Nottingham before. And so in accepting this invitation, it clearly behoved me to find out a little bit more about the university which is hosting this conference and about the partnerships and the relationships that have made it what it is today. Most of you will know, of course, that Nottingham University is one of the highest-ranking higher education institutions in the UK and ranks among the top 1% of all universities in the world. This achievement clearly didn't happen overnight. In the 1920s, lecturers here at Nottingham included such luminaries as the Mahatma Gandhi, Albert Einstein, H.G. Wells, and most recently, Nottingham has produced at least 2 Nobel Prize winners, firmly cementing its standing as a research-led institution. In terms of infrastructure, the 1920s was a great time for the university, when the largesse of wealthy individuals like Sir Jessie Boot, the first Baron Trent, resulted in land and buildings for the then University College. And not even he could probably have envisaged that one day Nottingham would have campuses as far afield as Ningbo, China, and Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, as well as this plethora of campuses across Nottingham. So since its inception as a place of adult learning over 150 years ago, Nottingham has grown to its current incarnation as a public research university with an enviable reputation for not only attracting the brightest and the best of students, like my niece, Sanya Ori, but also as a great employer. And why would I bother to speak to an audience comprised predominantly of Nottingham faculty and students about the history of its own institution, of their own institution? Well, this brief and somewhat patchy history I've just given is indicative of some of the points I will be exploring with regard to partnerships or working relationships. How educational institutions or individuals within or across institutions choose to work with one another is described in all sorts of ways. We speak of linking or link agreements. We spell out memoranda of understanding or memoranda of agreement to describe what we mean by linking. We talk of partnerships and of collaborations, but at the heart of all of this is a desire to work together and a need, therefore, to understand fully the implications of so doing. In Nottingham's past, both the city and the university are gifts of land and lidos. On the one hand, the givers may well have been recognized for their largesse by receipt of a peerage, but they would also have had the satisfaction of seeing their hard-earned money put to use for the benefit of future generations. The university and the city, on the other hand, gained space within which to grow, buildings in which to educate and be educated, recreational spaces for city folks who most certainly would not have been in a position to access a private swimming pool. And of this particular relationship between a benefactor and recipients, this tidily answers the question that these days we're far too sensitive to ask, which is, what's in it for me? A gift or an endowment that is not only pleasing, but useful to both the giver and the recipient is one mark of a successful partnering. In today's world, however, we are keen for the word partnership to go beyond social responsibility and into the realms of equity, sustainability, and mutual self-interest. So as I introduce to you some of the OER projects ongoing in Africa, I hope you will see how critical it is for partners to have a common understanding of these sorts of terms. Let me start then by telling you a little bit about OER Africa, the initiative which I lead. It was launched in February 2008 with seed funding from the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, which has funded a lot of OER work across the world, as you know. And we're founded as an initiative of the South African Institute for Distance Education. OER Africa then provides SADI with a framework under which we are able to deploy African experts and African expertise to harness the concept of OER to the benefit of education systems on the continent and around the world. As I say, we're headquartered in Nairobi, and there are compelling reasons for our desire to bring to African higher education institutions the concept and the practice of open educational resources. And whilst these reasons are numerous and varied, I will try to put them into some sort of context. Since the 1960s, a period in which many African countries and therefore many African universities gained independence from colonial rule, social and developmental changes across the world have had a dramatic impact on educational practices globally. Within the higher education realm, in which OER Africa primarily operates, this is very apparent. In Africa, as in any developing region of the world, faced with the need to educate a greater cadre of professional, mid-level managers, teachers, doctors, nurses, technicians, and so forth, distance education, once perceived by some as a poor relative to face-to-face education, has taken on new meanings. Print-based distance education, coupled with good tutorial and assessment feedback systems, remains critical in Africa. That said, though, in order to meet the ever-growing demand for higher education, pedagogy has evolved, and technology has enabled the morphing of the paper-based correspondence course into synchronous and asynchronous online distance education. Despite its many successes, educators and potential students alike, and quite properly in some cases, maintain mixed feelings about the quality of education possible at a distance. The concept, however, and indeed the demand for access to lifelong learning is now a widely accepted precept. Regarding access to education, then, the notion of opening education has spurred not only the universal growth of open and distance education institutions, but also that of movements, for lack of an alternative term, such as the open courseware and open educational resources movements, which are central to today's gathering. At OER Africa, we define open educational resources primarily as educational resources that can be used without the need to pay royalties or license fees. The need to pay for educational resources then brings us to the choices faced by educational institutions that grapple with extremely limited funding and infrastructure amidst the competing priorities of identifying, retaining, and remunerating aptly skilled faculty, providing adequate student support, funding research and innovation, fulfilling the social responsibility expected of public institutions, which many African universities are, and the possible impact, therefore, of open educational resources upon this paradigm. As is the case elsewhere, higher education institutions in Africa are expected to produce research, publications, and provide service. Teaching is implicit, but rarely foregrounded in terms of policy. And while a university is expected to offer a broad domain of expertise, the reality is that most higher education institutions specialize in or are known for particular strengths. Whereas faculty with the skills to teach in a broad spectrum of subjects may exist, the time that they have to revisit and modify curriculum on a regular and systematic basis is constrained. In the developing world, publications produced by the universities via journals, books, or digital formats are an infrequent occurrence, partly because of lack of finances and partly because research grants are few and fiercely competitive. The cost of contemporary copyrighted texts are prohibitive, and so the library stacks are mainly filled with obsolete or outdated texts. As elsewhere in the world, Subject matter experts are not necessarily great teachers. Opportunities for peer interaction and observation via lecture exchange programs are few. And in a competition, seniority will usually win over genuine passion. Technology, too, is often a challenge. It is not always the case that faculty have access to a personal laptop. And although this is becoming increasingly common, we have found that faculty are not supported necessarily in making the best use of what IT is available. This could be related to the absence of appropriate institutional policies, or because those with the IT skills needed to enable the use of new technologies are frequently poached from higher education by people like the mobile phone companies, for example. Insufficient and costly bandwidth makes a mockery of the notion of browsing the internet for content. Access is limited, then, not only by cost, but by erratic power supplies, and also, in some cases, location, whereby hotspots and often cable-based internet access may be situated nowhere near faculty offices, rendering moot the notion of using the internet to participate in interinstitutional collaborations, or indeed to access content created elsewhere. The impact of all of this is an increasingly frustrated faculty and student body. When we speak to faculty about the possibilities of OER, this is faculty in African higher education institutions, they remind us that chronic underfunding to which they are subjected means that some are lecturing 200 students in classrooms designed for 50. One professor ironically described this phenomenon as a very special instance of distance education. They remind us that many barely have enough time in the day or the week or the month or the year to write up their class notes, deliver their lectures, write exams, create marking schemes, mark exams, conduct any meaningful research, follow through to get that research published, either complete their own PhDs or have an entire conversation with their spouse. And as we listen, we see that faculty are growing older, and there is scant evidence of clear succession policies being put in place. So even as we accept that faculty in Africa are thinly stretched, we must also recognize that many of our very best intellectuals are teaching outside of the continent, and that the very best of those who remain or return work extremely hard to fill the void. A conference concerned with open learning is clearly supportive, then, of the OER Africa vision for higher education in Africa, one that is comprised of vibrant, sustainable African higher education institutions that play a critical role in building and sustaining African societies and economies by producing the continent's future intellectual leaders through free and open development and sharing of common intellectual capital. In other words, a vision in which Africa plays an active role as a producer of knowledge within this global knowledge economy. If African higher education institutions are neither vibrant nor sustainable, we may continue to be faced with a sort of leadership that exacerbates our economic and societal changes. There is much that we can learn from each other, that open development and sharing between our HEIs and of all our intellectual capital can only be of benefit to the entire world. What then is the role, if any, of open educational resources, either in bridging or amplifying the chasm between those who benefit from this new knowledge economy and those whose educational fate may have been signified by its arrival? Is it to provide content which may or may not be fit for purpose? Or might the role of open educational resources be that old adage about teaching a man to fish? Well, we at OER Africa believe that OER provides a bridge to improving and enriching the landscape of higher education. We believe that they present us with the potential to access affordable, high-quality resources and adapt them to specific needs and specific contexts. As educators create and adapt OER, they have the opportunity to re-examine the ways in which they think, to re-examine the ways in which they teach, and to rethink the ways in which their students learn, to consider and to reconsider the art or science of pedagogy. As educators share their resources with others, they open the door to have others share with them. Collaborative development of educational materials results in far richer products than a single mind, however beautifully trained, might have created on its own. As students gain access to OER, whatever their format, paper or electronic, they are empowered to study on their own, to seek out alternative ways of learning, to play a part in how and what they learn. At the same time, just because content exists or is accessible, it does not mean that it is relevant or even that it is factually correct. Meaningful participation in this OER movement demands of educators as of students rigorous standards of discernment if we are to sort the wheat from the chaff. As institutions are faced with educators and students who are thinking about education in different ways than in the past, they are obliged to review their policies pertaining to remuneration and promotion, policies pertaining to quality and to licensing, policies pertaining to the frequency with which an institution should review its curriculum offering if it is to remain true to its mandate. In engaging with the concept and the practice of OER, institutions may then come to realize that their potential to revolutionize teaching and learning is worthy of considerable attention. This then is OER in action. Our approach to OER collaboration is as far as possible to avoid replication of existing efforts and to try, wherever possible, to ensure that we engage with networks that have already identified a common problem or goal and may require different kinds of support or expertise in reaching that end. Where that end may be to bridge gaps identified in existing curriculum, the choices may be to import content from elsewhere, with all the inherent challenges we have already looked at, to adapt existing content, which whilst time-consuming may generate useful pedagogical skills, to create new content from scratch, or to do a mixture of all three. A great example of such a practical approach is the Health OER Network, which began as a partnership between the University of Ghana and the University of Michigan, and now comprises a partnership between the Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology, the University of Ghana, the University of the Western Cape, the University of Cape Town, the University of Michigan, which most of you will know is one of the leading medical universities in the US, and OER Africa. The objectives here were varied. Some people wanted to bridge existing gaps in their curriculum. Others wanted to digitize existing content so that they could share it with others. The materials that they've produced to date range from videos to PDF files, mainly around boils and knives. And the results of this collaboration include cross-institutional transfer of knowledge, skills, and expertise. And I'll talk a little bit about that. For myself, I learned just how much medical practitioners love their knives and their boils, to talk about them, to video them, to engage you in conversation about their coloring, their size, whether or not they pulsate, and other such merits. But for the staff, what we found was that they were completely inspired. When we first started talking about staff in the Ghanaian and the South African universities about open educational resources, some of them had heard of this before, some of them hadn't, but they were wary. They didn't know what it was, and they had enough challenges, frankly, on their plates already. But when they started to actually do the work, to develop these videos, to digitize their files, to make them accessible to their students, they ended up showing off to us, oh, guess what? I don't have to make copies for my students anymore because they're pirating my work. They're sharing it on flash disks, they're sharing it on CD-ROMs. The faculty, who had been so wary at first, were energized to do more, and we've seen this. The impact on students, on our website, you'll see, if you want to, a video of a Ghanaian student talking about what it meant to have access to resources that she didn't have before. The difference it made to being able to go into her medical class, having seen or watched a video of one of her professors conducting an operation, and so that even when she went into the ward, and of necessity being a student was at the back of the room, behind the nurses, behind the doctors, behind the fourth-year medical students, so that she could barely see the professor, could barely hear him. She still had an idea of what he was talking about. And so when they went into class then, both the students and the professors found that the quality of teaching and of learning was significantly improved, because the sorts of questions that students were now able to ask were completely different from in previous years when they hadn't been able to access these materials. On the institutions themselves were unexpected collaborations, those unexpected, unintended consequences. At the KNUST, there's now a relationship between the College of Health Sciences and the Faculty of Fine Arts, because this seemed a logical way of helping the academics in the medical department to improve the quality, the look and feel, as it were, of their resources. So now, together, they have conversations about Creative Commons licensing. But most important, I think, with regard to this Health OER network, is that the materials produced by these 5 institutions are not just being used in Africa. Today, university students at the University of Michigan in the US have access to materials, videos, lectures produced in Africa about tropical diseases, about Buruli ulcers, whatever it is that interests them, that they did not have. They didn't have access to these materials before at the University of Michigan. So this sort of exchange is very critical when we start talking about what it means to have a successful OER partnership. This particular one, then, is a very good example of a collaboration in which teams that work collaboratively obtain greater resources, greater recognition, and reward when facing competition for finite resources. The next step, then, over the next 2 years, is to grow this Health OER network into a broader and more vibrant African Health OER network designed to strengthen the intellectual and policy infrastructure within and between African institutions. So amongst the things that we aim to achieve in this next phase are to ensure that the OER infrastructure model that we piloted so successfully maintains momentum with the current participants and begins to attract new participants. We hope also to aggregate a critical mass of African-produced health open educational resources and make those available to the rest of the world, to anybody who would wish to use them through institutional and regional repositories. At a much newer stage of existence is a Rwanda distance learning pilot project, which I'll speak about quickly. Something you may not know about Rwanda is that the pace of work there is extremely brisk. I discovered this after a serendipitous meeting with the Vice Chancellor of the National University of Rwanda. I met him in August this year at a conference in Accra. Professor Silas Lwakabamba is a large man. I don't know if any of you know him, so he speaks from a great distance. And when he saw me, he said, "Catherine, what are you doing now?" And I said, "This is what we're doing now." And he said, "Come to Rwanda." So we did. Neil Butcher, my colleague from South Africa, and myself, we hopped to it, and we dutifully went to Rwanda. And we didn't really know what to expect. Not surprisingly, we found a country that's emerging from this crisis that it underwent. And at an educational level, one of the things that this means is that there's a need to overcome not just language, but technological barriers when it comes to education. Why I say this is because in the past, the Rwanda education system was based on the French model. People were educated and spoke in French. Since the genocide, people have thought they want to move away from French. They are changing the education system to one that is an English-based education. But when you have a system where most of your academics and most of your students have been trained in one language and in one system, and you're now moving to another, you can imagine the sorts of challenges that has built into that. That and the fact that many of their academics didn't survive the genocide. Technological challenges, obviously infrastructure is growing all the time in that country and is being built all the time, but it's not as widespread as they would like. And so they have a need, which is why Professor Lwakabamba was asking Neil and I to come and speak to them, to provide education at the point where people are, education for all of those people whose education was interrupted, as well as those who want to build new skills. And so not merely in Butare, where the National University is located, nor in Kigali, the capital, where there's the Kigali Institute of Science and Technology, but also in more distant places like Rusizi, which is one of the most deprived and distant areas, although distance is relative when you're talking about a country as small as Rwanda. And as I say, when we got there, we found that the energy and the speed with which things are happening in Rwanda, and are expected to happen in Rwanda, left Neil and I quite breathless. So this then is the requirement on the slide, and they're seeking to deliver a new degree program effectively for the students and efficiently for themselves in terms of cost. And the university hopes to find a model that will increase their presence in remote areas, thereby making them a truly national university. They want to widen their own scope for tailored and targeted outreach, professional development, and updating courses. They want to provide evening courses that are more useful than their current programs. They want to improve the quality of their master's programs. And finally, they know that anything that is produced as a result of this particular program will also be very useful to the programs that they're already running during the day on campus in Butare. So in the course of tomorrow and later today, Neil will be talking in far greater detail to those of you who are interested in learning more about how you or your institutions might contribute to this new initiative in Rwanda, as well as about another new potentially OER-driven project, and this is the last one that I'll be speaking of today. And it's the Executive MBA program, which is being developed as we speak at Kenyatta University, where the School of Business there proposes to respond to market demand while simultaneously taking advantage of the recent launch of the undersea fiber optic cable to combine traditional face-to-face and e-learning modes of content delivery in a one-year executive master's program in business administration. So this, too, is one of those instances where the right open educational resources might make all the difference to the university's ability to deliver quality and cost-effective products within a relatively short time span. And as I say, Neil will be speaking much more about these two programs. So collaborative energy is a wonderful thing. And in creating, using, and adapting OER, we don't always need to be high-tech. What perhaps is key is a shared understanding that if an OER collaboration is to be effective, however creative its participants may be, however innovative the idea or ideal that brought them together, however practical the objective the partnership seeks to meet, if it is to be a truly effective collaboration, it has been noted that the following things must be in place. There must be a willingness to change. And what this means is that partners must be prepared to accommodate differences in institutional cultures and practices and willing to adapt their own practices to harmonize with those of others. And this requires a special sensitivity to different assumptions about curriculum, about pedagogy, about institutional culture. Another key thing that must be in place is that people must be interested in building a relationship that is sustainable. This highlights the need for trust, for shared values, and a methodology for embedding these in the interinstitutional as well as the interpersonal relationships around that partnership. There has to be some sort of synergy where all the partners perceive the mutuality of the benefits involved, even where these may differ for each institution or each individual, and accordingly put in place the necessary practices and resources to manage the changes that are going to occur effectively. It has also been noted that successful partnerships take time to achieve, and they can be difficult. A case in point is our host institution. About 150 years ago, Nottingham, as I said, was a small college of adult education existing in one cramped building. Through gifts and endowments, through collaborative research projects, through sheer determination in some instances, it forms today part of the Russell Group, a collaboration of 20 UK universities that together receive 2/3 of the research grant and contract funding in the UK. This is a relationship in which each member works with the others to the mutual benefit of all. And by all, I mean the institutions concerned, as well as the faculty and students associated with so prestigious a network. In conclusion, then, none of us would be here today if we did not know just how effective collaborative energy can be in addressing the wonderfully varied challenges of delivering cost-effective, timely, and relevant teaching and learning experiences. And yet, OER debates continue to range around how to cross the chasm from early adapter to majority adoption. And although we might quibble with the question, we might suggest that it is a morass rather than a chasm, or even that a movement can never transform higher education, neither in Europe nor in Africa. We must remember that when it comes to OER partnerships, there is a need for sensitization about what OER is and what it is not, and for dispelling some myths, which may appear evident, self-evident, but are not always so. There's also a need to work systematically with partners to enhance institutional capacity in higher education, to design, develop, and deliver quality higher education programs and materials. There is a need to advocate the merits of collaboratively creating and sharing intellectual capital in higher education as a mechanism for improving quality and enhancing long-term cost effectiveness. There is a need to help higher education institutions establish policy frameworks that support openness in the development, adaptation, and use of educational resources and convert this into sustainable business models. So in short, we at OER Africa see open educational resources not as a panacea, but as just one possible incremental step to improving the quality of higher education, a bridge to improving and enriching the landscape of higher education in Africa. Thank you very much.